Have you tried watercolour but found it difficult to preserve the white of the paper for those really crisp white highlights? I'm going to show you some really easy ways to get those really bright white highlights. I'm Kirsty Rebecca and I create drawing and painting tutorials that are easy to follow so that you can create realistic and professional artwork even if you're just starting out. If you're interested in following along with this tutorial in real time, I actually have a full-length tutorial with voiceover instruction on my Patreon channel, so I'll leave a link to that in the description below. Traditionally, if you want bright highlights with watercolour, you'd have to plan your piece first and work out where you want to have the lightest colours, so that way you don't add too much of the darker paint there to begin with. And watercolour is one of those mediums where you have to work from light to dark, which is kind of unnatural for those of us who are used to other mediums where you can add lighter colours over the top of darker colours. But there are actually a few techniques that will help you get those bright white highlights. The first technique is to use masking fluid. I used a masking fluid pen by the brand Molotow just to mask off the bee in this picture, but you can also just use a normal masking fluid with a brush as well. I wanted to make sure that I didn't get any purple on the bee, and it makes it so much easier to paint the background in without having to worry about getting paint on that area. In this case, I just used this technique to avoid getting the wrong colours on my main subject, but you could also use masking fluid to keep your highlighted areas or white areas from getting paint on them. Once you have finished painting the area around it, or you've completely finished your painting, you can just remove the masking fluid and reveal the white of the paper underneath. Another option is to actually use some different suppliers that aren't necessarily watercolour. In general, I still like to work from light to dark with watercolour, just building up that intensity and the values as my layers develop. But I really don't worry about adding those crisp highlights until the end because you can actually use suppliers like gouache, for example. And if you don't know what gouache is, it's basically an opaque watercolour. So you can literally paint on your white highlights on top of your watercolour. A lot of watercolour purists don't believe that you should use gouache with watercolour. They think that it's cheating, but in reality, gouache is light fast, it's archival, and it mixes extremely well with watercolour. I enjoy using it, and it really makes the process so much easier and more fun for me, and that's really what art is about anyway. I used the gouache throughout this project to lighten some areas or also add more crisp white details as well. If you add more water to it, it becomes more transparent or see-through, whereas if you add less water, it will stay more opaque and give you those crisp white details. The great thing about gouache is that you can mix it into your watercolour paint, or also paint over the top of it with watercolour as well. So if you mix the gouache in with your watercolour, it does tend to create a more sort of pastel colour, but it helps you make your watercolours a little bit more opaque. And if you want an area to be a lighter yellow, for example, if you just tried to paint yellow over a darker colour, it's just going to slightly tint that colour a bit yellow. So instead, you can paint that area with white gouache, wait for it to dry, and then add your yellow on top, and it's going to be much more vibrant and yellow than if you tried to paint it over the top of a darker colour without that gouache there. You can also use any colour as well, it doesn't have to be white. If you want a super dark black or a more rich, vibrant kind of colour, you can also use different colours of gouache as well. Watercolour is also a fantastic medium to use as a base for other mediums. So you can actually use things like coloured pencil, gel pens, pastel, acrylic paint, or a lot of other things to create those brighter details on top if you want to. And most of these options are light fast and archival too, so there are a lot of different options for you to create those brighter highlights on top of your watercolour paintings. In this piece, I also used some coloured pencil to help brighten some areas and also to define some areas with a bit more crisp details. If you would like to learn more about different watercolor techniques, I have a tutorial in the top corner that you might be interested in, so click on that and I'll see you over there.